Imagine waking up to a nightmare where your family's Last Supper turns into a bloody tableau of dismembered horror ranged like a twisted feast. What if the monster behind it was someone you'd trusted for decades? This chilling tale from America's dark past will make you question everything about human endurance and revenge. Buckle up, because we're about to unravel a story so gruesome it exposed the rotting core of a nation's shame. Hit that like button if you're ready for the truth, and let's dive in. On the morning of October 5, 1852, Sheriff Jonathan Hale received what he would later describe as the most disturbing call of his 25-year career. A blood-soaked field hand had stumbled into the town of Oak Ridge, Georgia, screaming about bodies. Lots of bodies. Hale arrived at the Montgomery Plantation to find a scene that defied comprehension. In the main house's dining room, the remains of the Montgomery family sat arranged around their mahogany table as a frozen mid-meal. But these weren't bodies anymore. They were pieces. Carefully arranged pieces. The local physician, Dr. Elias Thornton, would later write in his official report, "The precision of the cuts suggests someone with extensive knowledge of anatomy." Each limb had been separated at the joints with surgical accuracy. What authorities discovered in the days that followed would shake the foundations of Georgia's plantation society. The killer wasn't some deranged outsider. He was a slave who had lived among the Montgomerys for over 25 years. A man they had trusted, a man they had underestimated. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The year 1852 marked a turning point in American slavery. The abolitionist movement was gaining momentum in the North, while the South tightened its grip on what they called their peculiar institution. Georgia, once the cradle of American liberty, had become something else entirely, a breeding ground for human cattle, where slaves were raised like livestock to be sold throughout the Deep South. Savannah County, Georgia, embodied these contradictions perfectly. Here, among rolling hills that had witnessed the birth of American democracy, stood plantations that made their fortunes trading in human flesh. The county's proximity to Atlanta made it a crucial hub in the domestic slave trade, and wealthy plantation owners competed to showcase their prosperity through the number of souls they owned. The Montgomery Plantation sat like a feudal kingdom on 3,000 acres of prime cotton land. Robert Montgomery had inherited the property from his father in 1825 and had expanded it into one of the county's most profitable operations. By 1852, he owned 150 slaves, making him one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. His success had afforded him a grand Georgian mansion, complete with marble floors imported from Italy and furniture crafted by the finest artisans in Atlanta. But Robert Montgomery's wealth came with a price that extended far beyond money. The Montgomery Plantation operated under a system of control so rigid, so psychologically devastating that it broke most men's spirits within months of arrival. Robert had learned from his father that the key to managing slaves wasn't just physical punishment. It was the systematic destruction of hope itself. The plantation's slave quarters told the story of this philosophy. Unlike other plantations where families were allowed to live together, the Montgomerys deliberately separated husbands from wives, parents from children. Robert believed that emotional attachments made slaves rebellious, so he made sure such attachments could never form. Children were sold away from their mothers at age 6. Husbands and wives were housed in different quarters and allowed to see each other only on Sundays if they had earned the privilege through perfect obedience. Among the 150 souls owned by Robert Montgomery, none had endured this system longer than Elias. Purchased in 1827 as a 22-year-old from a failing plantation in North Carolina, Elias had spent 2 decades watching the Montgomery system destroy everyone he had ever cared about. He had seen his wife Clara sold to a plantation in Alabama in 1830. He had watched his children's 3 sons and 2 daughters disappear one by one into the vast machinery of the slave trade. But Elias was different from the other slaves in ways that the Montgomerys never fully understood. Before his enslavement, he had been a butcher's apprentice in Savannah, learning not just how to slaughter livestock, but how to preserve meat, how to use every part of an animal, how to work with knives and cleavers with surgical precision. These skills had made him valuable to the Montgomerys, who put him in charge of slaughtering livestock and preparing meat for the plantation. What they failed to recognize was that Elias's skills extended far beyond butchery. He was literate, a secret he had hidden for 25 years. He could read the newspapers that Robert Montgomery carelessly left around the house. He knew about the growing abolitionist movement. He understood that the world was changing, even if Georgia seemed determined to resist that change. More dangerously, Elias was a student of human nature. 2 decades of systematic dehumanization had taught him to read people with uncanny accuracy. He knew which overseer could be bribed, which house slave might inform on him, which of his fellow slaves had been broken beyond repair. He had survived by becoming what the Montgomerys needed him to be: the perfect slave, obedient, reliable, invisible. The Montgomery family itself consisted of Robert, his wife Elizabeth, and their 3 children, Charles, 26, Victoria, 24, and young William Jr., 18. Elizabeth Montgomery was known throughout the county for her beauty and her cruelty. She took particular pleasure in psychological torture, often forcing slave mothers to watch as their children were whipped for minor infractions. Charles had recently returned from the University of Georgia with ideas about expanding the plantations operations and increasing its profitability through even more efficient exploitation of slave labor. Victoria, the family's only daughter, had developed what she called scientific methods of slave management. She kept detailed records of each slave's behavior, noting infractions, signs of rebellion, and what she termed moral character defects. Her notebooks, which would later be discovered by investigators, revealed a mind obsessed with control and categorization of human beings as if they were livestock. Young William Jr. was perhaps the most dangerous member of the family. Having grown up surrounded by absolute power over other human beings, he had developed into what one contemporary observer described as a creature without conscience. He routinely tortured slaves for entertainment, often betting with friends on how long a slave could endure various forms of abuse. The plantation's daily routine reinforced the family's absolute authority. Slaves were awakened at 4 a.m. by the ringing of a bell and were expected to be in the fields by sunrise. They worked until noon, when they were given a 15-minute break to eat cornmeal and whatever scraps were available. Work resumed until sunset, after which they were allowed to return to their quarters for a meal of cornmeal, molasses, and occasionally a small portion of salt pork. Punishments for infractions were swift and brutal. The Montgomerys maintained a whipping post in the center of the slave quarters, where public floggings were administered for offenses ranging from talking back to working too slowly. But physical punishment was only part of the system. The Montgomerys had perfected psychological techniques designed to crush any sense of individual identity or hope. Elias had endured this system for 25 years, watching it destroy everyone around him. But by 1852, something was changing. Perhaps it was the news filtering in from the North about the growing abolitionist movement. Perhaps it was the realization that he was now over 45 years old and had spent half his life in bondage. Or perhaps it was simply that 25 years of systematic dehumanization had finally pushed him beyond the breaking point. Whatever the cause, Elias began to change in ways that no one around him noticed. He started paying closer attention to the family's routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He began testing small boundaries, taking an extra moment to complete a task, making barely perceptible expressions of defiance when he thought no one was watching. But Elias was careful. 2 decades of survival had taught him patience. He knew that any plan for freedom would have to be perfect because there would be no second chances. The penalty for rebellion was death, and that death would not be quick or merciful. As the summer of 1852 drew to a close, Elias began to formulate a plan that would either secure his freedom or end his suffering forever. What he couldn't have known was that his plan would expose the true horrors of the plantation system in ways that would shock even a society accustomed to the brutalities of slavery. The stage was set for a confrontation that would forever change how people understood the depths of human cruelty and the price of systematic oppression. The first sign that something was wrong came on July 15, 1852, though at the time, no one recognized it as significant. Elizabeth Montgomery complained to her husband that several pieces of silverware had gone missing from the dining room. Robert dismissed her concerns, assuming that one of the house slaves had simply misplaced them during cleaning. The silverware was never found. 4 days later, Dr. Elias Thornton was called to the plantation to examine one of the field hands who had suffered what appeared to be a severe cut to his forearm. What struck Thornton as unusual was the precision of the wound. It looked almost surgical. He would later write in his journal, "Too clean to be an accident, but not jagged enough to be the result of a fight." The injured slave, a man named Jacob, claimed he had cut himself on a piece of broken farm equipment. But when Thornton examined the supposed source of the injury, found no evidence of blood or damage that could have caused such a wound. Jacob, however, stuck to his story, even when pressed for details. Elias, who had been working nearby when the accident occurred, offered to help treat Jacob's wound. Thornton was impressed by Elias's knowledge of basic medical treatment and his gentle bedside manner. He seemed genuinely concerned for the injured man's welfare, Thornton noted. It was clear that the other slaves looked up to him as a leader and healer. What Thornton couldn't have known was that he had just witnessed Elias's first test. The cut on Jacob's arm had been deliberate, a practice run to see how cleanly Elias could make an incision with one of the stolen knives. Jacob had agreed to the experiment because Elias had promised him that what they were planning would eventually free them all. 3 weeks later, on August 12th, another incident occurred that should have raised alarm bells. Victoria Montgomery discovered that several pages had been torn from her slave management notebooks, specifically, the pages containing detailed information about each slave's background, family connections, and behavioral patterns. When she questioned the house slaves about the missing pages, they all claimed ignorance. Victoria was furious, not just about the theft, but about what it implied. Someone had been reading her private notes, which meant someone on the plantation was literate. This was a serious security breach, as literate slaves were considered extremely dangerous. They could forge passes, read abolitionist literature, and communicate with the outside world. Robert Montgomery ordered a thorough search of the slave quarters, looking for the missing pages and any other evidence of forbidden literacy. The search turned up nothing, but it created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that permeated the plantation. Slaves were questioned individually about their ability to read, and several were subjected to brutal interrogations based on nothing more than suspicion. Elias watched these interrogations with interest, noting how the family members reacted under stress, how they treated their subordinates when they felt threatened. He was gathering intelligence, learning everything he could about their psychology and their methods of control. The stolen notebook pages had given Elias invaluable information about his fellow slaves, their histories, their breaking points, their potential allies and enemies. More importantly, Victoria's detailed notes had revealed the extent to which the Montgomerys viewed their slaves as objects to be manipulated rather than human beings. Reading her clinical descriptions of torture and psychological manipulation had eliminated any lingering doubts Elias might have had about the necessity of what he was planning. September 2nd brought the most serious incident yet. Charles Montgomery was found unconscious in the cotton fields, suffering from what appeared to be a severe blow to the head. When he regained consciousness, he claimed that he had been attacked from behind while inspecting the crop. He couldn't identify his attacker, but he was certain it had been intentional. Dr. Thornton was called again, this time to treat what he diagnosed as a serious concussion. Charles's injuries were consistent with being struck by a heavy blunt object, possibly a farming tool. However, no weapon was found at the scene, and none of the field slaves admitted to seeing anything suspicious. Robert Montgomery was convinced that his son had been the victim of a slave rebellion and ordered severe punishments for the entire field crew. 12 slaves were whipped publicly as an example to the others. and food rations were cut in half until the perpetrator confessed. The punishment had exactly the effect that Elias had anticipated. Rather than cowing the slaves into submission, it created anger and desperation. Several slaves who had previously been reluctant to consider rebellion began approaching Elias with questions about resistance and escape. Elias listened to their concerns and gradually began building a network of allies, though he was careful not to reveal the full scope of his plans. What the Montgomerys never discovered was that Charles's attack had been a carefully planned ambush. Elias had studied Charles's daily routines for weeks, learning exactly when and where he would be most vulnerable. The attack had been designed to test Elias's ability to approach a target undetected and to gauge how the family would respond to a direct assault on one of their members. The response had been predictable: brutal collective punishment designed to turn the slaves against each other. But Elias had anticipated this reaction and had prepared his allies for it. Instead of creating division among the slaves, the punishment had unified them in their hatred of their oppressors. September 15th marked the final escalation before the ultimate confrontation. Elizabeth Montgomery discovered that someone had been in the family's private quarters, going through personal belongings and documents. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, but it was clear that an extensive search had been conducted. More disturbing was what appeared to be messages left behind, subtle rearrangements of objects that seemed to mock the family's sense of security. Elizabeth's jewelry had been arranged in patterns that resembled shackles. Robert's business papers had been sorted in ways that highlighted the brutal economics of slavery. Purchase receipts for slaves arranged next to profit statements, creating a visual narrative of human suffering converted into monetary gain. The psychological impact of these intrusions was devastating. The Montgomerys had always felt completely safe in their own home, protected by their wealth, their social status, and their absolute power over their slaves. The realization that someone had been moving freely through their most private spaces shattered their sense of invulnerability. Robert hired additional overseers and instituted new security measures. Guards were posted around the main house at night, and slaves were subjected to random searches and interrogations. The plantation began to feel more like a military fortress than a family home. With the Montgomerys essentially under siege in their own property, the security measures came too late. Elias had already gathered all the intelligence he needed. He knew the layout of the house, the family's routines, their strengths and weaknesses. More importantly, he had identified which slaves could be trusted to help him, and which posed a threat to his plans. The notebook pages had given him detailed psychological profiles of his targets. Victoria's clinical observations had inadvertently provided Elias with a roadmap for psychological warfare. He knew exactly which buttons to push, which fears to exploit, which traumas to trigger. The stolen silverware had been converted into weapons, knives sharpened to surgical precision implements that could cut through bone and sinew with devastating efficiency. Elias's butchering skills, honed over 25 years of slaughtering livestock, had prepared him for what he was about to do to human beings. Most importantly, the series of escalating incidents had served their purpose. The Montgomerys were psychologically prepared for an attack, but they expected it to come from outside, from abolitionist raiders or runaway slaves from other plantations. They never suspected that their doom was had been living among them for 2 decades, quietly studying them and planning their destruction. The final test had been the most important one. On September 30th, 5 days before the murders, Elias had conducted what he called a dress rehearsal. In the middle of the night, he had entered the main house and moved through every room, timing his movements, testing locks and windows, identifying potential obstacles and escape routes. He had stood over each sleeping family member for several minutes, close enough to hear their breathing, close enough to smell their fear-induced sweat. He had tested his ability to move silently, to avoid the creaky floorboards, to navigate in complete darkness. Most importantly, he had confirmed that he could overcome his victims before they could raise an alarm. The dress rehearsal had been perfect. Elias now knew with mathematical certainty that his plan would succeed. The only question remaining was whether he would have the psychological strength to carry it through to completion. As he prepared for the final confrontation, Elias reflected on the 25 years that had brought him to this moment. Every humiliation, every loss, every moment of systematic dehumanization had contributed to his transformation from victim to predator. The Montgomerys had created their own destroyer through their cruelty and arrogance. On the night of October 4, 1852, Elias made his final preparations. He sharpened his weapons one last time, said goodbye to the few slaves he considered friends, and prepared to write his name in blood across the pages of Georgia history. Dawn broke gray and cold over Savannah County on October 5, 1852. The first person to discover what had happened at the Montgomery Plantation was Jeremiah Brooks, a field hand who had been working on a neighboring property and had come to borrow farming equipment. Brooks later told investigators that he knew something was wrong the moment he approached the main house. The silence was unnatural. Brooks testified at the subsequent inquest on any normal morning. You could hear the family stirring about, giving orders, making noise. But that morning, it was quiet as a tomb. Brooks knocked on the front door repeatedly, but received no answer. When he walked around to the kitchen entrance, he found the door standing wide open. Inside, he could see clear evidence of a struggle: overturned chairs, broken dishes, dark stains on the wooden floor that he immediately recognized as blood. Brooks ran to the slave quarters, shouting for help, but found them almost entirely empty. Of the 150 slaves who had lived on the plantation the day before, only a handful remained. Most had fled during the night, leaving behind their few possessions and disappearing into the Georgia countryside. The slaves who remained were in a state of shock that bordered on catatonia. When Brooks questioned them about what had happened, most could only stare at him with wide, traumatized eyes. One elderly woman named Lydia managed to whisper, "Elias done it. Elias done it all." Brooks sent one of the remaining slaves to fetch Sheriff, while he began a more thorough investigation of the main house. What he discovered in the dining room would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Montgomery family had been arranged around their mahogany dining table as if they were sharing a final meal, but they were no longer recognizable as human beings. Each family member had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision. Their remains carefully positioned to create a grotesque parody of domestic tranquility. Dr. Elias Thornton arrived with Sheriff Hale and immediately began documenting the scene. His official report, preserved in the Savannah County Courthouse, provides a clinical description of what they found. Robert Montgomery was seated at the head of the table, his torso upright in the chair, but with both arms severed at the shoulders and placed on either side of his dinner plate. His legs had been removed at the hip joints and positioned beneath the table as if he were sitting normally. The head remained attached, though the neck showed evidence of deep cuts that had severed the major blood vessels. Elizabeth Montgomery occupied her usual seat to Robert's right. Her body showed similar systematic dismemberment, but with additional evidence of ante-mortem torture. Multiple shallow cuts covered her arms and torso, suggesting prolonged suffering before death. Her hands had been severed at the wrists and were found placed palm up beside her plate as if she were asking for mercy. Charles Montgomery's remains showed the most extensive mutilation. In addition to the standard dismemberment, various organs had been removed and arranged around his place setting. The killer appeared to have used his anatomical knowledge to remove specific organs while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. Thornton's report continued for several pages, documenting each horrific detail with the detached precision of medical scholarship. But even his clinical language couldn't disguise the sadistic artistry of what had been done to the Montgomery family. Victoria Montgomery's body told perhaps the most disturbing story. Her killer had clearly spent considerable time with her, creating what Thornton described as a methodical exploration of human anatomy. Her famous notebooks had been found scattered around her chair, their pages soaked in blood and used as napkins during her dismemberment. Young William Jr.'s remains were discovered in the library, arranged in what appeared to be a reading position. Books about slavery and plantation management had been stacked around his dismembered body, open to passages that described the most brutal forms of slave punishment. His eyes had been carefully removed and placed on the open pages as if he were studying the text even in death. The killer had left other messages throughout the house. In the master bedroom, slave auction receipts had been arranged to spell out the word justice across the blood-soaked bed linens. In Robert's study, business ledgers documenting slave purchases and sales had been torn apart and scattered, with the monetary values of human beings circled in what appeared to be blood. Most chilling of all was what investigators found in the kitchen. The room had been converted into what could only be described as a butcher shop. Meat hooks hung from the ceiling, and cutting tables had been arranged with surgical instruments. But these instruments weren't for processing livestock. They were stained with human blood and tissue. On the largest cutting table, investigators found what appeared to be a meal in preparation. Cuts of human flesh had been arranged as if they were being prepared for cooking, complete with seasoning and garnishes. A note written in blood read, "Finally, the masters will feed their slaves." Sheriff Hale immediately organized search parties to hunt for the escaped slaves. But he knew the chances of finding them were slim. Georgia's dense forests and extensive network of underground railroad stations provided numerous hiding places for fugitives. More importantly, the remaining slaves claimed that Elias had given his followers detailed plans for escape routes and safe houses. The few slaves who had remained on the plantation were subjected to intensive interrogation, but they revealed little useful information. Most seemed genuinely traumatized by what they had witnessed, and their testimonies were fragmented and contradictory. Lydia, the elderly slave who had first identified Elias as the perpetrator, provided the most coherent account. "Elias, he changed over the summer," she said. "Started talking about justice and freedom. Said the masters were going to pay for what they'd done to our people. But I never thought he meant this." When pressed for details about Elias's plans and co-conspirators, Lydia could only repeat, "He said it was time for the masters to understand what it felt like to be carved up like animals. Said they've been treating us like livestock for so long. Maybe they should know what it's like to be slaughtered." Dr. Thornton's examination of the bodies revealed disturbing details about the timeline of the murders. Based on the state of decomposition and the patterns of blood flow, he determined that the killings had taken place over several hours, beginning sometime after midnight and continuing until dawn. The victims were not killed quickly, Thornton noted in his report. The precision of the cut stagger and the minimal blood loss from major wounds suggests that the perpetrator had extensive knowledge of human anatomy and took great care to keep his victims alive as long as possible. This was not a crime of passion, by methodical execution carried out with surgical precision and deliberate cruelty. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that the victims had been conscious for much of their ordeal. Bite marks on wooden furniture and rope burns on the victims. Remains indicated that they had been restrained and forced to watch as their family members were systematically tortured and killed. The crime scene suggested that Elias had begun with William Jr., the youngest and weakest family member, and had worked his way up to Robert Sr., saving the patriarch for last. Each family member had been forced to witness the fate that awaited them, creating a crescendo of psychological torture that accompanied the physical mutilation. As news of the murder spread throughout Savannah County, panic gripped the white community. If slaves could do this to one of the most powerful families in the county, what was to stop them from attacking other plantations? Within hours of the discovery, militia units were called out to patrol the countryside, and emergency meetings were convened to discuss security measures. But even as the manhunt intensified, investigators were beginning to understand that they were dealing with something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. This wasn't a spontaneous uprising or a crime of passion. It was a carefully planned act of revenge carried out by someone who had spent years studying his victims and perfecting his methods. The Montgomery Massacre would force, Georgia's plantation society to confront uncomfortable truths about the system they had created. For the first time, they were seeing themselves through the eyes of their victims, not as benevolent masters, but as monsters who deserved everything that had been done to them. The investigation into the Montgomery Massacre became the largest manhunt in Georgia's history. Governor Henry McAllister personally ordered the mobilization of 3 militia regiments, and rewards totaling $7,000 were offered for information leading to the capture of Elias and his accomplices. Professional slave hunters from as far away as Louisiana descended on Savannah County, turning the search into a massive commercial enterprise. Sheriff Hale quickly realized that he was dealing with a perpetrator unlike any he had encountered before. Elias had clearly anticipated the investigation and had taken extraordinary precautions to avoid capture. The escaped slaves had scattered in multiple directions, making it impossible to track them effectively. It's more disturbing. Several plantation owners reported that their slaves had begun acting strangely, whispering among themselves, refusing to work efficiently, and showing signs of what one overseer described as suppressed excitement. Dr. Thornton continued his forensic examination of the crime scene and made several disturbing discoveries. Hidden beneath floorboards in the slave quarters, investigators found detailed maps of the surrounding counties, lists of potential safe houses, and what appeared to be a comprehensive intelligence network, documenting the movements and habits of white authorities throughout the region. Elias had been planning this for months, possibly years, Thornton reported to Governor McAllister. The level of preparation and strategic thinking demonstrates intelligence and education that we never suspected. He had transformed himself from a slave into a military commander, complete with reconnaissance, logistics, and escape plans. More alarming was the discovery of Elias's personal journal, written in careful script and hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. The journal revealed the depth of his planning and the philosophical framework that had motivated his actions. Excerpts from the journal, preserved in the Georgia State Archives, provide chilling insight into Elias's transformation. September 10, 1852. The final preparations are complete. I have studied them as they have studied us, cataloged their weaknesses as they have cataloged our suffering. Tomorrow night, they will learn what it means to be property, to be cut up and sold like livestock. Justice requires that they experience every horror they have inflicted upon us. The butcher skills they forced me to learn will serve a higher purpose. Every cut I make will be for Clara, sold away from me in 1830. Every scream will echo the cries of my children, torn from my arms and sold to distant plantations. They created me through their cruelty, and now they will face what they have created. The journal entries revealed that Elias had been in contact with abolitionist networks as far north as New York. He had somehow learned to read and write during his years of enslavement, possibly with help from sympathetic whites or free blacks in the area. More importantly, he had developed connections that had provided him with information about escape routes and safe houses. Federal investigators, brought in due to the interstate nature of the escape network, discovered that the Montgomery Massacre was connected to a broader pattern of slave resistance throughout the South. Similar acts of violence had occurred on plantations in Alabama, Florida, and Tennessee, all showing the same level of planning and surgical precision. The investigation took a disturbing turn when authorities realized that Elias had not acted alone. Analysis of the crime scene revealed that at least 3 other individuals had participated in the murders. Based on different cutting techniques and the sheer amount of work required to arrange the victims as they had been found. More troubling was evidence that the murders had been witnessed by other slaves who had chosen not to intervene or raise an alarm. Testimony from the few remaining slaves suggested that the plantation's entire slave community had known about Elias's plans and had either actively supported him or passively allowed the massacre to proceed. This revelation shattered fundamental assumptions about slave loyalty and the effectiveness of the plantation system's control mechanisms. If slaves could organize and execute such a sophisticated operation under the noses of their masters, the entire structure of Southern society was more fragile than anyone had realized. The legal aftermath proved equally challenging. Traditional slave codes provided no precedent for dealing with such an organized and politically motivated crime. The murders clearly weren't the result of temporary insanity or uncontrolled violence. They were deliberate acts of war against the institution of slavery itself. Governor McAllister convened a special commission to recommend changes to Georgia's slave laws. The commission's report, published in 1853, revealed the extent to which the Montgomery Massacre had shaken the confidence of the white population. The events at the Montgomery Plantation demonstrate that our previous assumptions about the docility and loyalty of our slave population were dangerously naive. We are dealing with individuals capable of long-term planning, sophisticated organization, and calculated violence that surpasses anything we have seen in previous slave uprisings. The Commission recommended sweeping changes to slave management practices, including mandatory literacy tests for all slaves, restrictions on slave movement between plantations, and enhanced penalties for any behavior that suggested organized resistance. More controversially, they suggested that the state might need to reconsider the economic viability of slavery if such incidents became more common. The manhunt for Elias and his co-conspirators continued for over a year, but no arrests were ever made. Several alleged sightings were reported in Illinois, Ohio, and even Canada, but none proved credible. Professional bounty hunters claimed to have tracked the fugitives as far as the Canadian border, but Elias and his followers seemed to have vanished completely. The failure to capture the perpetrators had profound psychological effects on Georgia's white population. The knowledge that the men who had butchered the Montgomery family were still alive, still free, and potentially planning additional attacks created a climate of fear that persisted for years. Plantation owners throughout the state implemented new security measures that transformed their properties into armed compounds. Guard dogs were introduced, slave quarters were relocated farther from main houses, and overseers were required to carry weapons at all times. Some plantations installed watchtowers and implemented curfews that applied to both slaves and white residents. The economic impact of these security measures was substantial. Insurance rates for plantation properties increased dramatically, and some insurance companies refused to cover plantations altogether. The cost of guards, weapons, and security improvements cut significantly into plantation profits, leading some owners to question whether slave labor was still economically viable. More importantly, the massacre had exposed the psychological toll that slavery took on everyone involved in the system. Dr. Thornton, who had documented the crime scene, suffered what would today be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. He retired from medical practice within 6 months of the investigation and spent the rest of his life campaigning for the abolition of slavery. "I've seen what human beings are capable of when pushed beyond endurance," Thornton wrote in a letter to his brother in 1854. "The horrors I witnessed at the Montgomery Plantation were not the result of savage nature, but of systematic brutalization that created monsters from ordinary men. We have created a system that destroys the humanity of both master and slave." The investigation also revealed the existence of a sophisticated underground network that had been operating throughout Georgia for years. Federal agents discovered safe houses, supply caches, and communication systems that had enabled hundreds of slaves to escape to freedom without detection. This network had apparently been coordinated by free blacks and sympathetic whites who had been systematically undermining the slave system from within. The Montgomery Massacre was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader campaign of resistance that had been building for decades. The failure of authorities to capture Elias or dismantle his network sent a clear message to other enslaved people throughout the South. Organized resistance was possible, and escape was achievable. In the months following the massacre, reports of slave rebellions and escape attempts increased dramatically throughout Georgia and neighboring states. The Montgomery case also attracted national attention and became a rallying point for both abolitionists and slavery defenders. Northern newspapers portrayed Elias as a freedom fighter driven to desperate measures by systematic oppression. Southern publications characterized him as a savage who had revealed the true nature of the African race. This polarization of public opinion contributed to the growing sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The Montgomery Massacre had provided both sides with powerful propaganda. Abolitionists could point to the systematic cruelty that had created Elias, while slavery defenders could argue that such violence proved the necessity of strict control over the slave population. By 1855, the immediate crisis had passed. But the long-term implications of the Montgomery Massacre continued to reverberate throughout Southern society. The comfortable assumptions that had sustained the plantation system had been shattered, and many plantation owners began to question whether their way of life was sustainable. The Montgomery Massacre marked a turning point in the American slavery debate, forcing the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about the institution that had shaped its economy and society for over 2 centuries. The systematic brutality that Elias inflicted on his former masters provided a horrifying mirror image of the violence that slaves had endured for generations, making it impossible for even slavery's defenders to ignore the system's fundamental inhumanity. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Georgia's legislature passed the most restrictive slave codes in the state's history. The Plantation Security Act of 1853 required all plantations with more than 60 slaves to maintain armed guards, imposed severe penalties for teaching slaves to read or write, and established a statewide surveillance system to monitor slave movements and detect signs of organized resistance. But these measures came too late to restore confidence in the system's stability. The revelation that Elias had operated undetected for years while planning his revenge exposed fundamental flaws in the plantation system's assumptions about slave psychology and loyalty. If one of Georgia's most successful plantations could be vulnerable to such a sophisticated attack, no plantation owner could feel truly safe. The psychological impact on the white community was profound and lasting. Dr. Abigail Reynolds, a physician who treated several plantation owners for what she termed nervous disorders following the massacre, documented a pattern of symptoms that would today be recognized as collective trauma. Sleep disturbances, paranoia, and obsessive security behaviors became common among Georgia's planter class. The comfortable fiction that slaves were content with their condition has been shattered, Reynolds wrote in her 1854 medical journal. These men and women who once slept peacefully in their mansions now start at every sound, question every servant's loyalty, and live in constant fear of the violence they have perpetuated returning to visit them. The economic ramifications extended far beyond Georgia's borders. Insurance companies throughout the South revised their policies, dramatically increasing premiums for plantation properties or refusing coverage altogether. The London Assurance Company, which had insured many Southern plantations, withdrew from the American market entirely, citing the unpredictable risks associated with slave-based agriculture. Agricultural journals began publishing articles about alternative labor systems, and some progressive planters experimented with paid wage labor. The Atlanta Agricultural Society commissioned a study comparing the productivity and costs of slave labor versus free labor, finding that free workers were often more efficient and reliable, despite higher wages. More significantly, the massacre catalyzed the abolitionist movement in ways that previous slave rebellions had not. The systematic nature of Elias's revenge, combined with evidence of his intelligence and education, challenged racist assumptions that had been used to justify slavery. Northern newspapers published excerpts from Elias's journal alongside editorials arguing that slavery inevitably corrupted both master and slave. Frederick Douglass, the prominent abolitionist and former slave, wrote extensively about the Montgomery case, arguing that Elias's actions were the logical result of systematic dehumanization. When a man is treated as a beast for 25 years, Douglass observed, we should not be surprised when he responds with the fury of a cornered animal. The real monsters in this tragedy were not the slaves seeking freedom, but the masters who created the conditions that made such desperate measures seem necessary. The massacre also had unexpected effects on Southern religious communities. Many prominent ministers who had previously used biblical arguments to defend slavery began questioning whether the institution was compatible with Christian morality. The Reverend Theodore Blackwell of Atlanta wrote in 1854, "The horrors at the Montgomery Plantation have forced us to examine our consciences. How can we claim to follow Christ while perpetuating a system that drives men to such desperate acts of vengeance?" Several denominations began modifying their positions on slavery, with some calling for gradual abolition and others advocating for significant reforms in slave treatment. These religious divisions would eventually contribute to the sectional splits that weakened Southern unity in the years leading up to the Civil War. The case also revealed the existence of what historians would later term the invisible war, a systematic campaign of resistance and sabotage that had been ongoing throughout the South for decades. Federal investigators discovered that the network that had helped Elias escape was part of a larger organization that had been facilitating slave escapes, providing weapons and supplies to resistance groups, and gathering intelligence on plantation operations. This revelation led to a wave of investigations that uncovered similar networks in Alabama, Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas. The scope and sophistication of these operations shocked authorities and forced them to acknowledge that slave resistance was far more organized and widespread than they had previously understood. The investigations revealed that free blacks, sympathetic whites, and escaped slaves had created an informal intelligence service that rivaled anything operated by official government agencies. They had detailed knowledge of plantation layouts, guard schedules, and the personal habits of hundreds of plantation owners throughout the South. Perhaps most disturbing to Southern authorities was evidence that some of their own citizens had been actively supporting slave resistance. The network included white merchants who provided supplies, ship captains who transported fugitives, and even some plantation owners who had begun questioning the morality of their own participation in the slave system. The Montgomery case also had international implications. European newspapers covered the story extensively, with many using it as evidence of American barbarism and hypocrisy. The British government, which had abolished slavery in its colonies in 1833, cited the massacre in diplomatic communications, arguing that America's continued tolerance of slavery undermined its moral authority in international affairs. French intellectuals, particularly Victor Hugo and Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote extensively about the case as an example of how oppressive systems inevitably generate violent resistance. De Tocqueville argued that the massacre represented the inevitable consequence of a system that denies basic human dignity to entire populations. These international criticisms stung American diplomats and contributed to growing pressure for some form of slavery reform. Southern politicians found themselves increasingly isolated in international forums, where their attempts to defend slavery were met with references to the Montgomery Massacre and similar incidents. The legal precedent established by the case also had lasting effects. The Georgia Supreme Court's ruling that slaves who committed capital crimes in the course of seeking freedom should be tried under military rather than civilian law created a framework that would later be applied to other resistance cases. This militarization of slave justice reflected the growing recognition that slave resistance constituted warfare rather than simple criminal behavior. More broadly, the massacre contributed to the intellectual framework that would eventually justify the Civil War. Northern politicians began arguing that slavery was not merely a moral wrong, but a direct threat to the security and stability of the American Republic. If slaves could organize such sophisticated attacks, they reasoned, the institution posed an existential threat to American democracy. The case also influenced the development of what historians would later call scientific racism attempts to use pseudoscientific methods to justify racial oppression. Some Southern intellectuals argued that Elias's intelligence and planning ability proved that he was an exceptional individual who should not be considered representative of his race. This argument allowed them to maintain their belief in African inferiority while acknowledging the sophisticated nature of the resistance they faced. By 1860, The immediate panic over the Montgomery Massacre had subsided, but its effects continued to shape American politics and society. The case had demonstrated that slavery was not a stable, sustainable system, but a powder keg that could explode at any moment. This recognition would eventually contribute to the election of Abraham Lincoln and the Southern decision to secede, rather than risk further slave rebellions. The massacre had also created a new archetype in American culture: the intelligent, educated slave who used his master's own tools against them. This figure would appear repeatedly in abolitionist literature and would eventually influence how Americans understood both slavery and resistance. Most importantly, the Montgomery case had forced Americans to confront the full implications of their peculiar institution. The systematic brutality that Elias inflicted on his former masters was horrifying, but it was also a precise mirror of the violence that had been inflicted on enslaved people for generations. In forcing white Americans to see themselves as potential victims rather than just perpetrators. The massacre had fundamentally altered the national conversation about slavery and human rights. What drove Elias to transform from victim to predator? Was his methodical revenge justified after 25 years of systematic brutalization? Or did his actions make him as monstrous as his former masters? The evidence suggests that Elias was neither hero nor villain, but something more complex, a product of a system so dehumanizing that it created its own destroyers. The Montgomery Massacre remains one of the most disturbing chapters in American history, not just for its graphic violence, but for what it revealed about the true nature of slavery. Elias's surgical precision in dismembering his victims mirrored the clinical efficiency with which the slave system had dismembered his humanity, piece by piece, over 2 decades. Perhaps most chilling is the realization that Elias was likely not unique. Throughout the antebellum South, thousands of enslaved people possessed the intelligence, skills, and motivation to carry out similar acts of revenge. The fact that such incidents remained relatively rare says more about the crushing weight of oppression than about any lack of capability or desire for justice. If this tale left you stunned, smash that like button and share it with a friend who thrives on historical horrors. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happened to Elias? Did he vanish into freedom or keep fighting from the shadows? Would you have snapped after decades of torment? Let us know your take. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more spine-tingling dives into America's forgotten nightmares. Next up, we'll unearth another twisted secret from the past that might just keep you up at night. Stay curious, and remember, history's darkest truths are always lurking just below the surface. Disclaimer: this video presents a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While based on extensive research into the historical realities of American slavery. The specific events and characters depicted are not based on any single historical incident. The story has been constructed to illustrate the psychological and social dynamics that existed within the antebellum slave system, drawing from documented accounts of slave resistance, plantation violence, and the broader historical context of 1850s Georgia. Any resemblance to specific historical persons or events is coincidental.